Hey, everybody. Alex Kapitko here, Centered from Reality podcast. Little update. The violinist across the street is back. I am hearing Save Your Tears again. The rendition doesn't stop. I love violin music, but Save Your Tears is just echoing in my head. So disclaimer, as always, there is noise outside. I've tried to mitigate it, blah, blah, blah. But anyways, today I'm excited. I have a guest on the show today. Very good friend of mine, Cole Costello. He has some interesting views. He's a fascinating guy. He's currently studying history as a master's, and I really consider him a forward thinker. Whether we agree or disagree on some of that, it's a moot point in my opinion. But today I want to bring him on to talk about kind of plethora of topics, including revolution, where our country's going, Marxism, what are the failures of communism? Can communism work? And we'll just kind of see where that conversation goes from there. But Cole, thanks for joining. How are you?
Doing well, Alex. Very happy to be here. Thanks again.
Yeah, we actually tried to record this a couple of weeks ago. I remember we were doing the screen record or screen capture, whatever it's called, and the audio wasn't too great, so we didn't actually save it. But you had some good points, and I was like, I think it's about time to get you on the podcast here. And you're the first guest. You're the first guest on Centered from Reality, and I think that kind of works out well. Give us a little background on kind of what you're studying, what your life's like, blah blah blah.
Yeah, of course. So right now I am, as Alex said, in a master's program for history at Cal State Los Angeles. And most of what I've been looking at so far has been American urban history in the early 20th century, and then race and labor relations alongside that. So that is what I'm doing currently. I spent about 4 years working in accounting with a property management company previously. And also, I just want to stress that while I do have a lot of Marxist views, I don't know quite what I consider myself. I don't belong to any groups. I really just tend to look at things with more of a historical background, and that's kind of what I hope to do today.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, for our listeners here, Cole Cole understands history very well. He's got me actually into people like Mike Duncan. Is it Cole? Mike Duncan?
Yeah, big fan of Mike Duncan, his Revolution series.
Right, exactly. And no, I think you summed it up well, because like my first question to start this off with is where do you land on the spectrum? Because I think we hear the term a lot. If you're a Republican, pretty much all of the left are now socialists. If you're on the left, there's the centrists like Joe Manchin that would be considered almost conservative Democrats. The AOCs, like where would you put yourself in kind of the current political landscape in the U.S.?
Yeah, and that's a question that I grapple with myself a lot of the time. And like, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if I have a good answer for you. Like, I know that I am fairly far left, and that's what a lot of my views line up with. But yeah, very difficult to say. I have a hard time really calling myself a Marxist a lot of the time. I don't really believe that the Democratic Party structure is doing a great job, so I'm fairly critical of them just in that. So yeah, I'm sorry if that's not a good answer, but like just somewhere on the left is as best as I can say, I think.
Yeah. I consider myself somewhere in the center right, even though when people ask me why, I also sometimes have trouble defining that. But let's unpack that. You said you have issues with the structural parts of the left. What are those issues, or like what makes you not just be able to easily define yourself?
A lot of it might just be naivety and still just like working out just what I understand and think to be right. But just in terms of the party structure and what you were talking about in the system, in a lot of ways, I don't know if the Democratic Party is any better off than the Republican Party, or like may even be worse off, because I feel like it's very, very splintered. I think the leadership is very out of touch with what's going on the ground and just what the common party member, like I am still a Democratic Party member, but like, yeah, I think it's very easy to be critical of them. I don't think they're headed in a very good direction. I think there's a lot of stagnation. And I think in a lot of ways that like right or left, the two-party system, that's something that we need to have a lot of changes with. Like whether it stays or not, like that's something that we need to drastically rethink.
Absolutely. And, we'll get into Marxism and historical Marxism and all that in a few, but, kind of going off that, I mean, I don't know if you've really seen what's been happening, with the government funding bill, And with the debt ceiling chaos, the government almost shut down again. Luckily, last night we, at the 11th hour, Congress again did their job. And for once, it's kind of interesting to me is because you would think with Biden as president, you would think the Democrats, I think, would come together and understand that the Republicans are just kind of looking at all the red meat right now. You know, they're looking at all the ways that they can maybe attack in 2022 based on just the disorganization in the Democratic Party right now. Because I think we are seeing a bit of a civil war inside the Democratic Party because for once it seems like Chuck Schumer, for example, who has always been somewhat of a moderate, it seems to me like he actually is willing to adopt the more progressive agenda, like the AOC and the Elon Omars, over working with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and others in the center. And to me, it shows like the Democratic Party has somewhat of an identity crisis. Like they're not really sure how progressive they want to go or if they want to stay in the middle. And I would agree with you. Is I think almost the two-party system doesn't really work anymore. It didn't work on the right during the Trump administration. I mean, Trump was able to kind of almost add fear, I think, into the Republican side, where it was kind of either fall in line or resign, you know? And do you almost feel like, because like this is kind of a rhetorical question, I guess, because I'm thinking out loud as well, but do you almost feel like the Trump years, as bad as they were, almost brought to light how broken our two parties are?
Certainly, yeah. And in a lot of ways, like this is something I feel like I've started to think recently. It almost feels like something of a missed opportunity. Like I don't even know like how like I don't know how to define that particularly, but like just in thinking about that and then now like it feels like a lot of that anger is gone. Like and there is like a huge swath, like largely like Democratic Party members that like is contented with just a politician in office that can look the part and walk in a straight line, say a few sentences correctly and not offend anybody. And I feel like that like certainly a step forward from what we'd had, but yeah, it like clearly aside from Trump's issues as a person, like he highlighted so many deficiencies in the political system, and that like it was last summer. Like I started to think like, is this the time when we're going to see like some drastic change in the country? Like it felt like things were just coming to a head, and then it almost just feels like it's settled down a bit, regardless of the criticism coming from any sides. Like it feels like it could have been an opportunity for more reactionary change, good or bad. I ideally think good, but yeah, I think more should have come out of that than had.
So then talking about kind of the inefficiencies, because obviously there's definitely a call in our generation about some sort of reexamination of what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be a capitalist democracy or a capitalist republic, I guess would be the better term. And I know there's a calling for more progressive policies, and the term Marxism has come up mainly on the right, attacking people on the left. But to you, what is Marxism? What would be your like ideal form of Marxism working?
Yeah, certainly is a loaded term. And I really, in my mind, have a couple of separate definitions of it. Like, I think some of that comes from my background studying history, because there is just like a historical school following like the ideas of Marx and just how history itself is told through like the rising of classes that are oppressed and a constant turnover, and that battle and friction between the classes is always the mover of history. And then there's also just kind of the economic Marxism, where capitalism at its stagnation, which as he saw it, like was factory production and industrialization, that like extremely grimy early mid 19th century capitalism, industrialism. He saw that form he saw ending just with like the common factory workers rising up and overturning the owners of the factories, the bourgeoisie, uh, seizing the means of production, as it were. And in a lot of ways, like the ways that Marx laid that out never happened. You look at the Soviet Union, that was a very feudalistic society in a lot of ways, very underdeveloped, very underindustrialized at the time of the revolution. So that did not play out how he would have expected. You look at a lot of the Latin American and Southeast Asian communist states, those did not play out in any way how Marx would have predicted. So in a lot of ways, the 20th century Marxist ideologies were somewhat of a hijacking of his principles and trying to fit square pegs into round holes, so to speak.
Yeah, no,
And
I
I
mean,
feel like that,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that confusion, I think, exists to this day, especially in America. Like a lot of people do not really understand communism or the theories behind it, or socialism.
Right, right. I mean, I somewhat agree with you where I think I think people see socialism and communism as mutually the same thing. You know, they see probably communism as kind of a malignant form of socialism. But I think you mentioned something well because I was in the Czech Republic in Prague a couple of years ago, and I did a tour of the communism museum there. And to me, there's like a very similar trend in a lot of kind of the Soviet era communism was or socialism, whatever you want to call it, socialist republic, whatever the bullshit is they tried to call that. And it was basically
Yeah,
like
whatever
all
the name was.
right, and it was like basically all the qualified experts were removed from their positions because they wanted to be independent of the regime. So all the bureaucrats, experts, qualified individuals were all removed and replaced by loyalists. You know, like it was the apparatchik. Is that how you pronounce it? I always have issues with that word. And it was just the people that were willing to tote the party line no matter what. And then it kind of became a favors system, a spoils system in a lot of ways that I think a lot of communists in theory wanted to get rid of. But instead, it seemed like it was not communal based equality, but it was more like they controlled production, they controlled labor, and they controlled the propaganda. So it just led to poor people getting poorer and loyalists being very comfortable. And
Yeah,
and I think also the US, like specifically, we have a lot of immigrants from the East and they are usually wealthier. A lot of the people that came over during that time that could get out of the Soviet Union got over here with resources, and so they have a very libertarian approach. And part of me thinks that between what we've seen through history and the stories we've heard from immigrants have painted a very bad picture. But like, do you think that there was ever a chance that the Bolshevik Russian Revolution would have ever worked, or was it just skipping too many steps?
I that is a tough question because I even backtracking a bit, there are a lot of thought leaders for socialist and communist ideas in the 20th century that I do respect and have regard for. Lenin is one of those. And I part of me just wants to say if Lenin had lived longer, then like who knows what could have happened. But like in a lot of ways, like the society just wasn't really, I think he was expecting too much of it. He had his hopes too high of what people would be able to do. And that's another thing is if you're even like, regardless of what like the thought leaders are thinking, like there has to be some kind of a structure going down. And human nature, like, yeah, like people start to look out for themselves, like certain types of people. And it's hard to police that and see, like, and clearly when you look at the Soviet Union, like in its later decades, that was in an advanced state of corruption. So, yeah, it's really difficult to say. But there was another thing you'd also said that in the immigrants coming to the United States, helping to paint a negative picture of communism. I think that's certainly the case. And you look specifically at Cuba too. Like I think there are a lot of Cuban people of Cuban descent living in America now that moved here during the revolutions because their families were the bourgeoisie. They were effectively being forced out or having things taken away from them, and they fled to America, and they tell these horror stories of communism. And we need to consider where these stories are coming from.
Yeah, I mean, but I would push back a little bit and say they were just the ones who could afford to get out. I mean, from what you hear
Yeah,
about
obviously not across the board. That's not the case, but
yeah, because I mean,
something to
if you
consider.
look at if you look at Ukraine in the 40s, 30s, and 40s, I mean, the poor people were resorting to cannibalism. The wealthy were able to maybe sneak out or get killed doing it. I mean, Cuba, I think though you're right, is a different scenario where there was Cuba's different. Like I think we need to agree that to like separate Cuba from the Soviet Union, because Cuba was
Yeah.
a Spanish was part of the Spanish Empire, had a revolution. It has a weird mix of Caribbean, African Caribbean descent along with Spanish descent, right? So it's a very stratified society where I could imagine that would create a very divided class system based more on race as well. Where in the Soviet Union, again, I'm not a huge expert on the Soviet dynamics, especially under Lenin, but to me it was more based solely on class and kind of demonizing class groups against each other. And the one thing you said though, I'm curious, do you actually think Lenin was good? Because at least from my understandings, he seemed like an autocrat just like the rest who wanted a party to tote the line that he was pushing.
I think he certainly had tendencies, but I think at his root, I think about that.
Please do. This is a thinking podcast.
I think he was a very big idealist, and again, expected a lot of people that like he didn't know personally, and like didn't have the same life experiences that he did. But yes, I would have been very curious what would have happened if he'd lived longer and stayed like just sort of like the party leader for even a decade or two. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that.
So where did the Soviet Union go wrong for you?
Maybe from the beginning, if I'm really being critical, because I don't know if it was really the Bolsheviks seized a window that they thought was going to close and probably would have. Russia was a very failed state at the time, the Russian Empire. The provisional government had no sway. So like they stepped in when it was a weak system and took over. And I don't really think, like, regardless of whether things were ready or not, I don't know if they even had the infrastructure to really like work out like what they intended. I think it was a way too big of a state. Their plans were too grand. They should have like focused more on international relations and trying to like I don't know when this would have happened particularly, but if I could say just a specific thing, which would be when they went wrong, it would be closing their doors or starting to view others as enemies more, rather like the socialism in one nation. I'm not a fan of that policy. Like initially, like in Marx's writings, like communism was meant to be a global like overtaking at the end, like maybe nation by nation in the beginning, but it was the workers uniting in the end, and that was all that really mattered.
Hmm. Yeah, because from what I've gathered, especially under Stalin, the the Red Army and Stalin's system to me was almost as anti-Semitic as the Nazis, as well to me, which kind of off the bat gives a red flag because, like you were kind of mentioning, it was supposed to be a class-based revolution, right? Not something based on race or ethnicity or religious values. But to me, if you do look at the Jews that were killed by Stalin, they weren't the same as Hitler. I'll make that clear. Hitler was much worse in terms of just numbers, but a lot of Jews died under Stalin, Khrushchev, and I'm assuming earlier under Lenin as well. Like, do you think that in some ways the worst demons of human nature were the problem in some ways?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think. I mean, obviously, when you look at Eastern Europe at the time, anti-Semitism was rampant. Like Marx, it's hard to find any writings of the time period that aren't anti-Semitic unless it's coming from a Jewish person. So clearly, I think that has to be considered. But do I like? I don't know if I put that beyond like. I don't know. I don't know if I would put that beyond individual responsibility either.
Hmm.
Like I think like there were a lot of good ideas and a lot of bad things that came out of the 20th century and a lot of these experiments. And I think one of the issues is we tend to look at the negative things that happened and then completely ignore what we should be gleaning from it. And like a lot of these negative, maybe not a lot, but we need to consider like what things happened that would have been even out of their control. Like consider the climate in Ukraine at the time of these famines. There's a host of other factors coming into all of these other things, and we shouldn't just disregard something as a whole because of a negative. There's still things that we can look at and learn from.
Yeah, I mean, but the famine, I mean, they turned the middle class against the poor, and then collectivization just sent all the crops to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So I mean, I would
Yeah,
say that was kind of a man-caused famine, but
yeah. All I'm saying is just examine all factors.
no, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and I think you touched on something good earlier, was that it's supposed to be communism or socialism to work needs to be global, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember my readings in college, the times we did have to read Marx, which I'm surprised Chapman actually had us read Marx at all, to be completely honest. But I remember him saying that it was just going to be the next evolution of capitalism, but it would need to happen on a global scale, which makes sense to me because our markets are so shared. Like one country cannot just go communist. I mean, we've seen that time and time again with Cuba, Venezuela, the Soviet Union, that they just get embargoed, right? They just get completely cut off from the world economy. And then their public provided goods just fail in a global economy and people starve. So like what do you think think's the step that would need to be taken? Like would it be a global movement or what?
I first to backtrack just a slight bit. I have to
Yeah, yeah.
contradict one thing that you said. Uh, Communism would not be the next stage of capitalism; it would replace capitalism. But moving
Fair.
forward,
Okay,
I
yeah,
don't.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, just in terms of how that goes about today, like I think it has to be international. Certainly, I don't quite know how it happens. Like that's another question. I don't know that I really have an answer for, and I'm sorry, but like it's really difficult to look at the way that we have like the structures in power that are in place now and how could that be overthrown. I There's every time we have this conversation, there's a very interesting article that comes to my mind, and I want to direct everyone to seek this out if they remember. It's by Chuck Klosterman, who's a favorite writer of mine, and I cannot remember the title of it. I'm sorry, I did not come prepared, but talks about just the feasibility of a modern revolution, and also bringing in just the Second Amendment, and just considering like if in a totally hypothetical world, not talking about today, say like our government is like unabashedly corrupt, needs overthrown. Do we just gather our neighbors with a bunch of guns, go to the what like that? We saw that happen pretty much.
Yeah.
So yeah, what like is there a way to overthrow like a government just with a people today? Does it have to descend into a full warfare? Like I the pessimist in me thinks like there has to be a civil war before anything like that can happen because I can't really see any other way that the people in power would let go of it without bloodshed.
Well, disclaimer to our listeners, I don't think either one of us want a civil war, but
No,
like
no.
like like going off of that, I mean, I was listening to Beg to Differ, which is the Bulwark Roundtable. I always like to listen to on Fridays. It's a center right, center left conversation. Really good. And they brought up somewhat of a similar point is that, okay, so a small percent of the far left said they'd be willing, less than, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was less than like 2% of people that identify as Democrats said they'd be willing to fight, right? And about the same was on the right. But the problem is in a country of what, 350, 360 million people, 2% of half of that is still a significant number. And the thing is that I think if you actually like, unfortunately, we've had the polarization of Trump, and we've had the polarization that the Democrats have done, I think, in other ways, in terms of like calling everything racist and trying to just kick everyone out of the dialogue who disagrees with them. So we've created a very polarized society to a point where, to me, it almost seems like there are people who have no faith in the system on both sides. You have the Trump supporters who I think if Trump ran again in 2024 and it's a close election, they would be fine with suspending the Constitution in order to save the
Yeah.
Constitution. And on the same side, I think if Trump won in 2024, actually won in 2024, I think there would be a significant part of the far left that would be willing to cause chaos on the streets. And in every revolution in history that at least I've seen, it's the same phenomenon, is where the extremes cause the beginning spark, but then the middle has to pick a side. And then from there, it kind of spirals out of control, you know? Um, I did the first podcast episode of this show kind of on that, where I just wonder how you salvage our system when the faith in our system is so low, and people really believe that maybe democracy isn't working for people anymore. Um, yeah, because I mean, but the question on that is like, do you actually think that we could create a better system in the embers of that?
I think it would take a lot of time, a lot of time. I think yeah, you need to be a drastically restructured society. I think probably some kind of just like, whether it's called a UBI or not, some kind of a baseline income probably. Like I feel like unless all industry and technology is destroyed, we still have like the capability for no one to go hungry, starve, and things like that. Everyone should have shelter. But yeah, I think just in terms of like everyone emotionally settling down, I think that could take a long time if it happened. And that's like something else to consider, is just how much does it take to push something over the edge? Like you said, like those 2%, if like they end up in the streets, how much would it take to get something to escalate into a full on breakdown? And then that's enough, like, yeah, it's hard to consider because like in those terms, it's not particularly what I want, but like for the change that I want to see, is that the only, I don't know, it's a curious thing to think about.
I was
I think there's
staying.
got to be another way.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That was kind of just my like, I don't, I really want to believe it doesn't have to resort to that, and there's another way that we get about this change that'll benefit everybody. But yeah, I guess we just have to stay optimistic about that and keep working towards it.
I think I've told you this when we've talked off, not on the air here, but I feel like we're at a time much like the Spanish Civil War, back in the late 20s into the 30s, where you basically had the nationalists who were Catholics and, considered military leaning hunting conservatives, right? Like kind of your textbook, neat, like pre-Franco type of individual, usually wealthier, conservative, religious. And then you also had the Republican side, actually, which was which were the center leftists. And over time, you had this breakdown where it became somewhat of a quasi symbolic war for the ideological divides going on in the world. So you had Stalin, well, Lenin at first, and then eventually Stalin getting involved for the left side. And you had Hitler sending help and ideas to the nationalist side. And over time, you saw this just complete division in society, where it was basically like family members were turning each other in if they were seen speaking out against who. And it brought up all these old class divides that people 10 years ago, wouldn't have even talked about. And going off of that, let me pull it up really quick. I finished Anne Applebaum's book, Twilight of Democracy. And there was actually a really good part I wrote down here. Let me find it. She talks about the Dreyfus Affair, which happened in France. Have you heard of that?
Yes, yes, I have. Yeah, it was Julia Louis Dreyfus's like grandfather, great grandfather, something like that.
Was it really?
It was, yeah.
Wow.
She was related to them.
Wow. I did not know that. That's insane. She's amazing, by the way.
Yeah.
But just to oversimplify this, it was just where this Jewish guy got caught or called out for treason when he didn't do it. And most of society backed him, but a lot of the anti-Semitic nationalist right-wing society in France created conspiracies around him that demonized him. And it brought up a lot of old tensions inside of French society that people thought were dormant and no longer existed. And what she says here was that this exposed divisions that no one knew existed. It was between people who previously were unaware about how many differences they had between one another. Soon they couldn't even talk to each other at the dinner table, yet alone have a conversation. And I feel like that's what happened in the Spanish Civil War, and that's what's happened actually in the United States since Trump.
Oh
There's
yeah,
been
it sounds way too much like the last few years.
It does, and like so it brings up a question: is like how does society go back from the brink? And yeah,
Yeah. One thing I want to point out, I've been thinking here, is Marx was a huge proponent of gun rights. I think he like saw that the change won't come without a struggle. It's just something to consider.
I've noticed since COVID, a lot of my more left-leaning friends have been more pro 2A than in previous times. I've heard comments like the Second Amendment's not just mutually exclusive to Republicans and stuff like that, which obviously it's not. But I think that is an interesting shift, which to me it's actually a troubling shift because it's showing that more people are paranoid and getting armed. Um, which I enjoy shooting, but I would not say I'm actually a huge gun advocate just because I don't think our society can handle them, to be completely honest. Like I've changed my views on guns quite a lot over the years. I just like in a vacuum, I love guns. I love shooting with my military friends, or I have a friend who's in the police and we shoot and I feel safe with them, because I just feel like we're in a controlled environment and everyone knows what they're doing. But I feel like over time, guns have become kind of a symbol of rebellion and that's not great. But that is an interesting point you bring up there. Like I, I think a lot of people don't understand Marx. Would you think that's probably correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say across the board, certainly a lot of Americans don't or really understand what he wrote about or how it applies. So yeah, I would encourage most people to go read a little bit more and get a better understanding of it all.
I want to just ask you about capitalism for a few minutes because I know you and I've talked about this a lot. How do you feel about the Scandinavian model? It's a model just for those who aren't who aren't familiar with it. Who are obviously you're listening if you're hearing me talk about this, but it's basically Scandinavia, especially Norway, is the one I want to mainly focus on. Norway is really wealthy and robustly capitalist, but they also use a lot of that revenue to uh, to expand their safety nets, and they have a lot of high taxes. So it's basically like the best of European social democracy with the best of American capitalism put into one system. Like, what do you think about that? Could that maybe prevent us from a civil war?
No, like
Great.
it's certain, yeah, it's certainly admirable what they've done. Like I think it's like a good like step forward and something to consider. But like I don't think there's any way that that model could be transferred onto something like the U.S. or like I don't know, like even not larger states, like smaller, poorer states. I don't think they could have anything even remotely similar. Like they're a very special case and they've done well with it, but I don't think they're really an example to be transferred elsewhere.
Yeah, you're probably right. It's just I'm still in I'm curious your thoughts on capitalism after here, but like I'm still a fan of capitalism in some ways, mainly because I think there's certain goods that need to be public goods, such as healthcare, water, infrastructure, transportation. Goods that can be generally shared and provided cheaper by the government. For the Again, obviously, cheaper is a hard term because private companies can be more efficient, but I think that efficiency is usually unfair, it's unjust, and it usually leaves a lot of holes. So, like, I think there's certain sectors that need to be public. But for me, I think investment, innovation, technology are things that I still think capitalism has been responsible for driving forward. I don't think we would have had a man on the moon, or we would have the vaccine. Think about this vaccine that they got out in record time, obviously with research they've been doing for decades. But there is something when you have the carrot dangled in front of you of profits, I think, along with being famous and getting attention and a reward for doing a good job. I think there's something that communism can't really address. I don't know your thoughts on that.
But what do we really need to go to the moon for?
Okay, the moon. Let's go. Let's stick with tech and vaccines then. Let's stick with
I
that.
like that example because it's like it's funny because in a lot of ways it was in a race with the communist state of the Soviet Union. But really, what was the point of it? Like that was just a power struggle there.
Well, if I can
But
interject for a
like,
second, we did get a lot of our modern, like everything from like modern microwaves and dishwashers, weapons that the government uses. Pretty much everything
okay,
came out of the
fair enough.
technology that we used to go to the moon. So it was like they did that first, and then a lot of that technology trickled down into the private sector.
All right, I'll give you that. Like there were other benefits we saw out of that, but that is something that I consider, like just in broad terms, what you're talking about. That is something I consider a lot because I like a free market. I like commerce. I like people being able to enter businesses with few barriers to entry. But like when you're thinking about buttons or tables or car, I don't know, some simple item, like that's a lot easier than like a computers or cars or something like that. Like our markets are really complex at this point. So it's not just so simple to say like public or private, good or bad. Like some things need to be like to be able to be produced, it will need an assembly line. It will need big facilities. It will need a lot of capital concentrated in one place. But I don't think we're doing it right. Is just the main thing. Like the problems we just come from a lack of distribution of the resources. Like too many like laborers on the ground are just being robbed of their like not earning what they've contributed. Really, like that's at the root of the at the end of it. That's what it all is.
Yeah, and I think those things can almost be separated. You know, like I think what SpaceX, for example, working with the government, I think Elon Musk's technology, reusable rockets, cheaper, more efficient, reusable. That's good, right? Like, and I like that type of stuff. But I also agree with you is that I think what boggles my mind so much is that I think most Americans are complacent with the system. They're they're disgruntled. If you look at public
Oh
opinion
yeah,
polls all the time, no one's happy, right or left. It's bipartisan. Like, and what worries me is like I don't see a positive outcome. Kind of going back full circle to the growing conflict that I see almost inevitable. Unfortunately, when people are disgruntled and nihilistic, it doesn't really create change, though. It just creates a vacuum for an autocrat to come in and just change the system for his benefit or her benefit, you know? Like, because most Americans are disgruntled and lost and not paid enough. We have a purpose problem. Like, but again, like do we solve capitalism or democracy first? That's, I think, the bigger issue.
I that reminds me of another thing Marx wrote just about like the recognition of the working classes of their place, and I he thought he cracked the code of history in that, just in that like rather than a cycle of dictators and autocrats just taking places of kings or business owners, what have you, like in his ideas, it was a recognition they were being oppressed by the worker, like the workers' recognition of being oppressed that would break the chain. And to this day, we still haven't seen that.
Well, do you think the so-called progressives are doing enough in the U.S.? Because I see,
I think they're
oh,
trying.
really?
I think there's a lot of antipathy towards it and just a lot of lack of understanding. I think like I don't know, I do think on the other side there's a lot of anger that there is a lack of understanding of those ideas. And I
Hmm.
can fully relate to that. But I think they're trying.
I just feel like at least a lot of the social media progressives are more worried about culture, identity, and gender. And that's not to say that those are not important issues. I think they are when talked about correctly and the discourse is meant to actually be productive. But to me, I see that the a lot of the progressives aren't actually focused on creating a more equitable society. They're focused on almost like an academic fascism. Like, and I know I've talked to you this before, is like I feel like the US is just sick and diseased with extremes that are toxic. Like I wish that AOC and Bernie talked more about the economics. And Bernie does. I'll digress a little bit on Bernie because he does talk about the economics, but I feel like the average person who identifies with Bernie or AOC they're not talking about like tangible solutions. They're talking about what did this person say on Twitter? How can we show them what's up? How can we make sure that this comedian doesn't ever have a platform again? It's it's almost like this authoritarianism as well on the left. Like I think it takes two to tango. And I think Trump brought out this authoritarian sleeping demon. And I think parts of the left have also adopted another authoritarianism that's just like not willing to have discourse with others, and that's counterproductive.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely think that's a problem. I would say, like you said, it takes two to tango. I think we have 8,000 tangoing right now. Like we. You also said there's so many extremes, and that's, yeah, there are hundreds of thousands of extremes in all those different directions, and that the social media progressives, I think that's just an extreme that, like, it's all just these different like angles that we're seeing just the top of the iceberg of, and that's just what we're getting. And yeah, it's obnoxious. And that's why I have a hard time defining what I am really, is because like a lot of it is getting to the bottom of all of these icebergs and finding out what like the root understanding of all these issues and the solutions are. And I feel like we have too much of, like, in our day, just people just picking off the tops of the icebergs that they like and going with that,
Hmm.
to speak metaphorically.
No, and that's why I like talking with you, is because I would not identify as a Marxist, that for sure, or even left leaning on that extreme. But I like talking with you about this because I think you understand the nuance of this period we're in. We are in a great schism. It's really hard to know the extremity of something when you're living in it. But like there's just such a myriad of factors right now that seem to be just compiling around the world that to me it seems like you're right. But unfortunately, I think both sides, all the coalition parties around the world, all the autocrats, all the Democrats, whatever, they're all focused on what they can see, what is tangibly visible to talk about. But there's these underlying issues. I mean, I was reading today in my public finance book, really, really exciting piece of literature. But they were talking that by 2034, Social Security is either going to need to be extremely cut, or we're going to have to bring in like 3 to 4 times the amount of revenue we're currently doing. And neither one of those are possible. But that's also the majority of our federal budget are on entitlements. So what do we do when literally taxpayer money might not even go towards what people are planning on doing? Because it's not discretionary spending, it's mandatory spending. But what happens when the mandatory spending can't even get to everybody? And so it's like the US is in cultural decline. Like something interesting, do you remember that Alaric the Goth book?
Yeah, I still have not read that, but I remember you talking about that a lot.
Yeah, I'm spacing on the author. He's from Austin, Texas. That's all I know. He's a professor at U of Austin. But great book. It's called Alaric the Goth. But it talks about how at the end of Rome, there was a high focus on xenophobia, but also on gender. It was basically like there was this growing nihilism inside of the Roman Empire, either the Eastern Roman Empire or the Western Roman Empire, that felt like there was this hopeless future. So people were focusing on more abstract topics. Like there was a look on gender fluidity. There was a look on xenophobia, like looking at where do our goods come from. It was like people focused at very different means because they realized that the external issues could no longer be fixed. And part of me feels like that's where we're at in the US right now, is this kind of late stage republic where it's almost like the future seems inevitably bleak. So we're focusing on things that maybe 20 years ago we wouldn't have even thought about.
Yeah, that is interesting. I don't know if I would so much conflate that with a gender identity. That sounds sticky, but
Could
that
be.
does remind me of something I was talking about with someone at work today, of just how, like, yeah, you look at, like, specifically in my eyes, housing and wages. Those are two things that are going to blow up sometime in our lifetime. We're going to have to see, like, whether we rebuild that or like fall into chaos. Who knows? But I don't know. I forgot where I was going with that. What did you say before that?
Well, I was just talking about how it seems like we're in a late stage where we
Oh
start
yeah,
focusing on these intrinsic issues that used to not be important to us.
yeah, that was it. We were talking about just how people just fall into their internet echo chambers,
Hmm.
And that's what everyone sees anymore. Like I'm fully guilty of that myself, but yeah, everything sucks. So why not just fall into the things that you like and hear things from people who think the same way that you do? And it's very comfortable. It's very pleasing. I can understand that. But yeah, I think there is a danger to that also. Like we don't, and that's one of the things that produced Trump. We don't need just people living in their echo chambers and never coming out.
Yeah, I've been watching that Q Into the Storm documentary on HBO. It's pretty interesting how that documentary goes through, and I haven't even finished it yet, but it goes through how 4chan and then 8chan, for those who don't know, they're kind of just dark, dark free speech sites that just pretty much allow any free speech to be had, and usually becomes a cesspool for the extreme racists and anti-Semites and etc. And so basically, this guy he used to be with Vice, I believe, and now he works for HBO. He basically just goes not even undercover. He just openly interviews all these 4chan and 8chan people, and he follows people that might be Q. And it just to me seems like Q started as a literally just a live action role playing game, a LARP. You know, people were at home, probably hadn't had sex in like 20 years. Sorry, we got a guy flexing out there in his got a guy flexing out there in his car. Anyways, but it basically became a live action role playing game, a LARP, where it was like these Q drops, you know, would be dropped by this person who was the same person every time. So there is technically a Q. Someone is dropping these Q drops, and the people would just follow them. And to them, it was all these secret signals. It was kind of like Easter eggs being dropped. It's like, where do we go to find the next one? And it gave a lot of people purpose. You know, and then you had Jeffrey Epstein's murder or suicide, whatever you want to call it. I go more on the side of murder, but and you just had this fueling of anti-elitism mixed with a lost sense of purpose. And like to me, if people were working, had decent jobs or a decent sense of meaning, they probably wouldn't be sitting on 8chan looking at the most vile racist videos. Because this documentary shows some of the stuff on 8chan, and you're just like, good God, like what is wrong with people? But like, do you think? Because to me that's what led to a lot of Trumpism, and I'm not trying to put a large blanket over it, but to me it's like globalization decimated America's middle class. It did. Um, you know, in the late '90s, we made a lot of deals with China. That's where Trump was actually right, I think, was that we did make a lot of bad deals for the US, but they weren't really bad for us in the long run because that's just where things were going. You know what I mean? It's like it's really hard to say they were bad when we just had a outdated industrial system and China could do it better. That's like simple comparative advantage. Um, but unfortunately, we never subsidized the people of Ohio or wherever it may be. We never gave them anything else. So we basically just said, all right, we're sending all your jobs overseas and you're just going to have to deal with it. And then, you know, the tech Silicon Valley bubble blew up. A lot of people were doing well. And I think a lot of people in the middle of America just saw everything kind of dry up around them. And
Yeah.
and like to me, that's why Trump is so unique in a way, is because he has a very close relationship with his voters. Even though he's a fraud and a liar, he speaks to them in a way that I have never seen another politician do. And that's why I think he's coming back, is because he did identify a serious issue, but he made it malignant. Like instead of saying let's actually find tax programs and federal subsidies to maybe do, you know, get back to work programs, build back better as Biden calls it now, you know, we could have done better things, but instead we just kind of forgot about these people, and then Trump finally heard them, you know.
Yeah, certainly.
So like do you think any of those people are lost? Like do you think somewhat of a revolution could bring some of those people back?
Like I would say currently lost, but yeah, like not permanently lost. But that's just, I don't know. I don't know how we go about that. Like if you look at like the years before the Russian Revolution, a lot of the elite academics tried like going to the peasants and teaching them their ideas, like fully believing that they were going to be the wheels of the revolution they were going to have to ride on. And it didn't really work. They couldn't really get anyone following them. I think there's just a lot of different ideas and understandings at play. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing to consider. And I certainly don't think that we're like, we've arrived at the final theories. Like, we have a lot of writing, a lot of theorizing, a lot of experimenting to go, but I don't know, we shouldn't just automatically discredit something. And I think America needs a good dose of communism and a good understanding of what that is.
Yeah. I mean, I would disagree with using the word communism, though. I think you'd probably want to start with socialism because, I mean, technically, I think socialism would be the next iteration, according to Marx, wouldn't it?
Yeah, according to Marx, but then that's like, if we're going according to Marx, that's impossible now, really. Like, there aren't just like, we're not a factory. Like, the place that he imagined it happening the first was Germany, his home. You saw like the industrialized area along the Rhine. That was where he imagined communism happening, and it never did. So he was wrong. Like, I think we should all agree to say that, but like, it does not mean everything that he said was wrong. I think there is a lot to gain in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marx, of the readings of philosophers I did in college, him and Thomas Hobbes actually were my two favorites, which are not
Interesting.
in the same sphere, right? Thomas Hobbes, very different, but yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you completely. Like, I honestly, that's why I still kind of lean towards, like, people are like, why are you still center right, but you believe in bigger public spending? I'm like, pre Nixon and Reagan, there was easy spending that could be done by Republicans, and they actually could get bipartisan commissions to do so. The last thing I want to ask you, and then we'll get out of here, is what do you think about the fetishization, excuse me, of Viktor Orban in Hungary? I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's almost become this weird thing where certain Republicans in the U.S. now are going to Hungary to kiss the ring. Mike Pence just met with a Holocaust denier and a conspiracy theorist. What's his name? Tucker Carlson did a whole week live from Budapest. Um, it's insane to me. Viktor Orban was this center right leader who came to power, and a lot of people thought he was this coming of Christ. Actually, like, even I, when he first got elected back into high school, was like, this guy actually seems like a good guy coming out of this ex-Soviet republic. And he's the one that created that George Soros, conspiracy theory that's very anti-Semitic. He said that he actually closed down public institutions, public colleges, opened up his own thought university, as he calls it. He says gypsies should be kicked out of the country. They built a wall. He actually built a wall. Like, I don't know your thoughts, but I think he actually did everything Trump wants to do. And so the Republicans are actually like fetishizing him.
Man, it sounds very dangerous. A lot of this I'm not very familiar with, just because I don't keep up for my own sanity on a lot of the finer details. But good God, that does not sound very good.
Yeah, he's him and the, I think, the Justice Party. It's like Freedom and Justice or something in Poland. They're both they're both very Putin-esque, but with a democratic like hinge to it. But I do worry that Plato, said democracy is the staging point for tyranny, and like I've almost, like, I'm still a capitalist, but I almost wonder if democracy is the problem.
I think it's some blend.
Mm-hmm.
I don't quite know where, but yeah, the concentration of wealth and resources, along with the concentration of just power and like entrenchment of power, I guess, it's not a good combination, and a lot of like a lot of overlap also, and it's just not been good.
Rapid question here: would you get rid of billionaires?
Oh yes, oh yes.
All of
Drop
them?
of a hat, yes, yes, yeah. There does not need to be a single billionaire.
Why?
That's ridiculous. That's way too. No one needs that amount of money. That is the most ridiculous thing in the world. At that point, like, no. If you get 999 million, you should just be capped. You get a certificate. You got as much money as is possible, and that's it.
You don't think that
No
there's
one
an
needs a.
incentive structure for people to want to become that rich?
That's ridiculous. No, like there's perfectly enough incentive to get $500 million, and you could be like as wealthy as you could ever imagine.
Yeah, I would take
There,
500.
no one needs $1 billion. That should be illegal.
All right. All right. Well, we'll agree to disagree on that one. I'll just leave you with this quote from Bret Stephens, New York Times. He said, "To say I agree creates community inside of a tribe. To say I disagree creates democratic discourse." And I think that's what I think we tried to do today. I think if you just keep agreeing with each other, it just consolidates the tribe. So I think it's good to debate and talk and
Get out of our get out of our echo chambers.
absolutely. Like I think that's one of the biggest issues I have with public discourse right now is that if you disagree with someone, they assume you hate them. So, you can disagree with someone and also like them as a person, which I don't think billionaires should. I think Jeff Bezos is bad, for example. But I don't know if I totally disagree with the idea of billionaires, but that's a conversation for another time. Cole, thank you for coming on today. It
Oh,
was
of
fun.
course. Had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Take care. And for always, you guys can find us here on the Tonic, or not the Tonic Accord. This is the Centered from Reality podcast. Again, on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Podbean. We'll be on Spotify next week. Let me know your thoughts. Do you want to come on? Do you know someone who wants to come on? Am I annoying? Let me know. You can comment in the section on YouTube, on Podbean, and on Apple Podcasts. Take care. Thanks, guys.